Hey folks, Ken Broadhagen here. You can check out the article version of this video at kenbroadhagen.net. I'm going to talk about AWS API Gateway and Lambda today. This video is going to show you how you can create a request object similar to Express.js and use that to access your HTTP headers, URL parameters, and query parameters. When I first started working with API Gateway and Lambda, I was kind of bummed when I needed to access some HTTP headers, but they weren't there in the event object, and I really thought they would be. So it turns out with a little bit of work, you can make that event object look similar to a request object, and this video is going to show you how to do it. The first thing I want to show is what this request object is going to look like. And to do that, I've just written a very simple Lambda function, which is going to print out the various parameters in the object and then also echo them back as the response to the Lambda. So you can see here we're just logging out several different parameters. So I've got the body, headers, method, params, and the query. And so what we've got here is the body, so that's going to be your post body or your put or patch body. Whatever data gets uploaded as part of the request itself. The headers are going to contain all of your HTTP headers like authorization, any custom headers you want. Method will be get, put, patch, post, delete options, whatever got sent in on the request. Params are going to refer to the URL parameters. So if you have like resource/ID, you'd probably make that ID a URL parameter and it would come through there. And query is going to be the query string parameters. So usually if you're filtering or sorting, you pass those in as query string parameters. Those are the things that come after the question mark and get separated by ampersands. So the query object is just those key value pairs stuffed into an object. Finally, we're going to echo back the event that came in. So if we just take a look at our test event that I'm setting up here in the body, I'm going to put in a couple of post params, headers, some generic header keys and values, method, I'll say post, parameters, I'll make a URL parameter, and query, a basic query string parameter. So we just test that. And you can see how they were echoed back in the response, just pretty much the exact same way that they came in. And if I go down further, in the log output, you can see that we're logging out the JavaScript objects here. Notice that in the response, here they show up as JSON, but in the log you can see that they're proper JavaScript objects, not string values. Here's the API gateway that uses my request object, and let me just show you how it gets created using the mapping template. So we go into our integration request, and under mapping templates, there's one for the application JSON content type. And over here in our mapping template, we've set up a mapping template instead of input pass through, and we've pasted this text in here. So it's kind of a big mouthful here, but this standard template here will always give you a request object, and then you can kind of parse it in different ways or manipulate it differently in your Lambda code. So basically what we do here is this mapping template is applied to the request coming in by API Gateway, and it executes this mapping template with some predefined variables, and these variables can be put into the mapping template to render it into a JSON object, and then that JSON object is provided to the Lambda event. And in the JavaScript Lambda, it translates that JSON object into a JavaScript object that you can parse. So let's walk through it. Remember, this is a JSON format with a template language. So for the most part, you're going to see everything quoted properly in JSON style. And then these dollar signs indicate usually a function of the velocity template language. So that's a templating language that was created by Apache. It's the same idea as like in Herb or Haml templating language, just a slightly different syntax, a little more Java-y, but it's the same sort of idea. And then there are a bunch of functions inside this templating language that you can kind of learn to figure out how to get exactly what you need. So we can see here we've got body, headers, method, params, and query. So those are all the objects that we provide in the request object, all the different properties. Body is going to be the request body, and the way we get that is we use the $input object and the JSON function on it. And this is going to get us the JSON content of the input body, of the request body, and it has the ability to fetch out different parts of the request of the body, but if we give it the $sign, that tells us that tells the function to give us the root of the JSON object, so it gives us the entirety of the request body, which is what we want in this case. Now under headers, you're going to see another function of the velocity template language, the for each loop. So this lets us iterate over some properties and create a line in the JSON request body or request document per each item that we iterate over. So we're going to iterate over the input params header key set. So input params is kind of like a collection of all the different types of parameters, header and path and query string. And then we access just the header parts using header, and then we use the key set function on top of that to get just the keys out of that. So you think of header as like if it were a JavaScript object, it would have a bunch of properties, and we just want the keys on there because we're going to make one property inside our headers object for each key that's there. And then what we're doing here with this header here is we're aliasing that as a variable. So each header key is going to be called $header. And then the next line here, we render it into the template. So $header will get rendered as whatever the key is inside that header. And then we need to render the value on the other side of the colon. And so there's a little bit more magic here that we have to do. So in this case, we're going to get that value from input params header get. And so that'll fetch the value of $header. So we're going to get the value of the property that's identified by the key in the $header variable. Now we're going to get that out, and of course we're going to be quoting this as JSON, but what if that value contains a quote of its own? That would screw things up, so we use our $util.escape JavaScript function, and that's going to escape it for us. And that way, no matter what's in the header, it's not going to blow up our rendering. If you forget the util escape JavaScript and you try to, and a header contains a quote, you're going to get some kind of an error in your Lambda log or your API Gateway log. It's not going to be able to create the request body for the Lambda, and it's just going to blow up and probably return you a 500 of some sort. Okay, so now we've got the property, we've got the key, and we've got the value. The next thing we've got to deal with is the comma. So if we have more than one property, we've got to add a comma after each one to get properly formatted JSON. And we don't want to have a dangling comma on the last item. So the way that we do that is we're going to guard that with a #if block. And basically, we've got a little utility in for each called hasNext. That tells us if there's another property in the mix. So we say if for each hasNext, then we'll render a comma. So that comma there is a literal value to be rendered in the template. So we render that comma, and then the #end just is the end of the if block in the velocity language. And then finally, this #end here ends the for each block. So all of that put together is going to render one line with the key and value for each of our HTTP headers. And now you kind of know all the magic here, so the rest of it is fairly straightforward once you understand that block. Method, that's going to be get, put, post, and so that comes out of this special variable $context HTTP method. And then params and query, those are set up the same way that the headers are. It just comes out of a different part of the $input, but the same pattern applies to those guys. And that is how that velocity template renders the request body. And so if you check out the article on kenbrodhagen.net, you'll see a link to the Apache velocity template language, so you can get a better idea of the syntax of that language. And there's also a link to the AWS documentation, which describes all of their special variables and functions like $util and $input. So there you have it. Okay, let's put together these two pieces, and I'll show you the full flow of creating this Lambda and API gateway through the AWS console. We'll start with the Lambda event. I like to start with the Hello World template and then just clear it out. I'm going to put in the example handler I showed earlier. We'll call this request Lambda. We're going to give it the Lambda basic execution role. If you've never done this before, you want to select the one with the star and it'll pop up a window and just name it Lambda basic execution. So we've created our function. Now we just want to test it. And it works. So now that our Lambda is created, we can move on to the API gateway. Creating the API gateway is pretty straightforward. Just going to create a method off of the root here. We'll do a post so I can show you all the different parameters, the post parameters. And we find the name of the Lambda function we just created. Now we go into integration request, mapping templates. We need to add one. Add the content type application JSON. Choose a mapping template. And I'm just pasting in the one that I showed earlier. And now that we've got the mapping template in place, we can deploy the API. Just go ahead with the default stage name of prod for now. And the API has been deployed. Now we can test it. Now to test our API gateway and Lambda integration, I'm going to copy the invoke URL from the stage screen here. And I'm going to move on over to Postman. If you've never used Postman before, this is a downloadable Chrome extension that you can use to test different REST APIs. The reason I use it is so I can actually test with a post here. So I'm going to change the method to post, paste in our API Gateway API. Now I'm going to fill out some example headers. The important one here is content type. Since we made our content type for the mapping template application JSON, I need to pass that along here as application JSON. Otherwise, our mapping template is not going to activate. And I'll just show you that really quickly here. We made the application template, we made the template application JSON, so it's going to render this template only when the content type matches here. So it's important that we match it up in Postman over here. I'll put in some example headers. We'll also give it some body text. And we can do a send. And so as you can see, the response, since we set up the Lambda to echo back the echo response, the event response, you can see we're getting everything back here. So here you can see the body. We got the post params from the body. Under headers, we got our header 1 and header 2, also our content type, and then we can also see all of the other headers that got sent along from Postman. And the method, as you can see, was post. I didn't specify any URL parameters or query parameters. If I just add a query parameter on here and run this again, you'll see our query parameter comes up in there. And so that's it. That's the successful test of our API Gateway and Lambda with the request object. Thanks for checking out the video. You can find a link to the article on my website below, and head on over to kenbrodhagen.net or subscribe to this channel to find more API Gateway and Lambda tutorials. Have a great day.